Hello everyone, I welcome you to today's webinar with the title Future of Materialography, Overcoming Regulatory Challenges. My name is Marko Milovanovic and I'm working here at QATM as a chemist, as a product manager and product developer. Today's topic is about rather non-typical information in regards to materialographic business, and we'll talk about how certain regulatory challenges, difficulties, and new classifications of certain substances that might be present in materialographic consumables can influence availability and usage, and discuss it in certain examples. You can ask your questions anytime in the chat, and my team and myself will try our best to answer your questions as fast as soon as possible. Just keep in mind, if your questions are not answered during the session of the webinar, they will be answered afterwards via email. Just to give you a short overview about the topics of today, the webinar structured as you can see in this slide. We'll talk about chemical perspectives and regulatory background, as well as the challenges of the individual preparation steps, building on the first initial information that we are talking about in the next two slides. We'll go about and over the individual preparation steps, and we'll talk about certain examples on where you can see how either regulatory changes and new knowledge about safety and hazardous materials or chemicals in certain substances influenced and changed materialographic consumable world. We can start today's webinar with a simple question: what chemical compliance really means. And you might have seen the term chemical compliance in our newsletter invitation or in our LinkedIn post. And what that basically means is that the following of all relevant legal, regulatory, and safety requirements. And at its core, it is about protecting people and the environment from harmful effects of chemicals. One key aspect of following chemical compliance is the proper classification and regulation of substances, which is somehow governed by international standards such as GHS, REACH, TSCA, and the CLP regulation, which define how chemicals must be labeled, how they have to be handled, and how they need to be used in order to being used safe. In Europe, for example, the European Chemicals Agency, the ECHA, is in charge of, together with national authorities, to oversee and enforce these rules in the European Union. However, compliance goes beyond following simple regulations, and it is also about requiring a clear understanding of how a substances behave, or more, what makes a substance dangerous. And this depends on several factors. For once, its intrinsic chemical properties, such as the toxicity, the reactivity, or persistence. How toxic is my substance? How strong or violently does it react with the environment or with human? And persistence, how long does my substance stay in the environment once released? Its physicochemical properties, the solubility or volatility, how violent does it react, and where is it soluble? Is it soluble in water? It is prone to being a hazard to water, for example. And the conditions of exposure, so basically the dose, the duration, and the specific area of application or exposure. In short, chemical compliance is not only about meeting standards on paper or blindly following any kinds of regulations, but also ensuring that chemicals are used safely and responsibly for the benefit of people and the environment overall. Why chemical compliance? The importance of chemical compliance is growing rapidly, and one of the main reasons is the increasing focus on environmental protection, overall protection, and occupational safety in order to minimize long-term risks and damages, and to minimize the impacts on people's health. Globalization adds another layer of complexity, which means that international standards such as the GHS and REACH regulations that we've talked about in the beginning aim to harmonize safety requirements across regions, countries, across depending on the regulation across the whole world. And at the same time, regulations are tightening and businesses must adapt to a more, let's say, demanding and global framework. We should not underestimate the role of public awareness as well. The public is more sensibilized um, due to better availability of information. Authorities are carrying out more inspections, safety expectations are rising, and the overall risk assessments must be far more detailed than in the past due to either better understanding of certain chemicals and their interactions with the environment or with the human body. And this often leads to stricter classifications of chemicals and higher demands for safe handling practices, which means in short that chemical compliance is no longer optional. It's becoming more and more a key factor in protecting either the people using certain chemicals and protecting the environment, and overall is it basically came here to stay, and safeguarding the environment and maintaining competitiveness in international markets is no longer non-intertwined. It has to be always viewed in combination, and has to be accounted for in the development of further materialographic consumables as well as overall assessment of processes. So that was a short introduction, a short crash course, an insight into regulatory compliance, chemical compliance, and we want to translate all this knowledge about and this background into the challenges that we as user of materialographic consumable materials might face during the individual preparation steps. And we'll go over in each preparation step, and we'll discuss it on some certain chosen examples. Just keep in mind, due to it being a bigger field, the preparation step of etching might require its own webinar, so we'll only talk about this in short. Our first example of today is according to the order of materialographic preparation, the process of sample cutting. We'll start the list of examples at the preparation step of cutting with a cooling lubricant, more detailed with the requirements which these cooling lubricants need to fit in. They must fulfill several functions at once. They provide cooling to avoid overheating. They lubricate to reduce friction and wear, to minimize the potential for deformation or damage of the sample. They protect against corrosion, and they need to remain stable against microbial infestation, which is usually achieved by adjustment of pH and the addition of biocides. And for a long time, boric acid has been widely used in coolants due to exactly these properties. It acts as a biocide, as a slight biocide, a pH buffer, a corrosion inhibitor, and was widely used in a multitude of systems due to having the perfect properties for that. However, boric acid was recently classified as toxic to reproduction, and I think it was about 3 years ago, which basically means that it is prone to stricter regulatory restrictions, and the call for a substitution became louder and louder and louder. And to explain on that, toxic to reproduction means that it is subject to CMR classification labeling, CMR standing for cancerogenic, mutagenic, and reproductive toxicity. And when a substance or chemical or mixture is labeled or classified as one of these, it is way more dangerous to the human body, and the regulatory concerns are way higher and stricter. And due to these properties, the call for substitution became louder and louder and louder. And current development trends clearly show the direction of material development towards boric acid-free coolants, compounds mimicking the structure and properties of boric acid. Here shown some exemplary molecules that try to mimic the overall properties of boric acid in terms of structure and properties. The use of alternative biocides and corrosion inhibitors, overall compliance with the coming tighter regulations. Focus is increasingly on sustainable solutions, so basically coolants that are safer to use, more environmentally friendly, and often based on polymer technology in order to mimic all the necessary property for use as a coolant. And all these approaches aim to combine performance with responsibility, ensuring both process efficiency, compliance with future regulatory frameworks, and QATM offers one system that is specifically aimed for, in that regard, a boric acid-free compound that is safer to use, our ATM CoolCut that is a ready-to-use coolant system meant as an alternative to boric acid containing lubricants. When we look at cutting processes, the cutting wheel itself has to meet several demanding requirements. It must offer high abrasiveness for efficient material removal, good durability to extend the wheel's service life, effective heat dissipation to prevent damage and deformation of both the sample and the wheel itself. And traditionally, for these purposes, cryolite has been incorporated into cutting discs. Due to the way cryolite behaves during cutting, it increases the removal rate of the cutting wheel, it improves heat conduction, and supports longer service life, and due to it increasing the cutting or to keeping the cutting performance constant. And the thing is, however, that cryolite is organotoxic and hazardous to the environment, especially due to the cutting wheel abrading into tiny particles, and thus cryolite being released in tiny fractions into the air, into the aerosol, into the coolant. And because of this, it is now under stricter regulatory assessment, and substitution has become more or less necessary. And the industry is moving towards alternative additives. Some of these are fluoride-free options because the fluoride compound is the reason for the hazardous properties to the environment. Silicates are being explored as well as ceramic additives to keep the abrasive properties of the material, to increase abrasiveness, to improve heat conductibility. Cutting processes face overall the same challenges as many other areas of material preparation, balancing performance with chemical compliance, in a lot of cases balancing it with sustainability, and moving away from hazardous substances while ensuring the tool quality and the safety during usage is the key to future developments in this field. So far, so good. That these were two examples for cutting related processes and how toxicity and new assessment of data and information changed the way companies used cryolite in their cutting wheels and in the processes, and how these influence the composition of, for example, cooling lubricants. And the next step, usually after cutting samples, is mounting of samples if necessary. Coming to the next preparation step, we'll take a look into epoxy resins in our example, and again into the requirements for such an epoxy resin to be used in materialographic cold mounting. These resins must provide strength and hardness for it to be sufficiently machinable and preparable. They have to show proper adhesion and low shrinkage. The reasons why we are using epoxy resins in the first place. They have to cure quickly enough and maintain a low viscosity for easy handling, for being applicable for materialographic purposes in the first place. And to achieve these properties, resins often contain modifiers such as phenols, which are added usually to the amine hardener component. And these are we have here two exemplary molecules of phenols. The phenol group specifically is the 6 ring with the OH on top, and without going into too much details, they decrease curing time and viscosity for way more user-friendly appliance. However, these modifiers based on phenols can be significantly harmful to health, which has raised regulatory concerns. Stricter regulations are now pushing for a reduction or substitution of these potentially hazardous components, especially considering that these phenols may be used in classic epoxy resin formulations by up to 30 to 60 weight percentage and are not incorporated into the epoxy resin itself and can be released during grinding and polishing processes. And as a result, there's a clear trend towards safer and more sustainable epoxy system solutions. and modern developments focus on formulations with fewer harmful modifiers without compromising the performance. So basically keeping the low viscosity and high adhesion, good adhesion, the fast curing, all so without compromising the performance. And a good example is the use of cardinol, which is the substance in the lower left corner. It is a bio-based modifier derived from the cashew nutshell oil, which provides similar properties, albeit with a slightly worse viscosity reduction property. So you need slightly more of cardinol compared to phenol, but keep the overall performance similar without the health risks that might be associated with traditional phenols, which are still used up to date, but um, these are proper alternatives. So, but you can basically say that consumables are evolving, so to speak, in accordance to chemical compliance and sustainability, which are becoming more important, as well as keeping the technical performance in check in line, driving the industry towards safer solutions without compromising the consumable quality. We can stay for an additional example here at the epoxy resins. Another way to influence the properties of an epoxy resin, for example, decreasing the viscosity, is by usage of reactive thinners, for example, glycerol ether. And I have shown here again two different examples of glycerol ether that are incorporated into the epoxy resin for it in order to decrease in viscosity. As mentioned, bisphenol A epoxy resin tends to show or have extremely high viscosities that make them non-applicable for materialographic purposes. And these glycerol ethers can influence the viscosity by reducing it in comparison to modifiers like solvents or plasticizers. These are also incorporated into the epoxy resin during curing and cannot leach out after sufficient curing. The thing is that this reactivity that makes it perfectly suitable for incorporation into the epoxy resin makes it also prone to problems or causing problems in the human body. These types or a lot of glycerol ethers can, depending on their reactivity and their size, how they behave in different media, influence the fertility of human and can also be mutagenic and also cancerous. And again, this leads them to being prone to CMR classification, labeling, and companies are looking for alternatives here as well. In this case, finding alternatives is a little bit harder because you just cannot simply substitute a reactive diluent with another without influencing either the properties of the system, be it the hardness or the curing speed. So the development of epoxy resin systems with less harmful components is slightly more challenging, and manufacturers are usually trying to search for alternatives which do not show as much reactivity in overall reactivity compared to the known glycerol ethers, and also modifying the epoxy resin system overall for it to have sufficient curing speed even without the potent reactive thinners. And QATM did their homework here as well. We have formulated a system that does not contain any CMR relevant components for it in order to be also applicable in the future and be compliant to a lot of pretty much all chemical regulations, which is our QBox 93 system. One last example for mounting for today is in this case not epoxy resins, but or not cold mounting resins, but medium hot mounting resins. We start here with the requirements as well. They need to have proper mechanical properties. They have to show sufficient dimensional stability during and after curing for it in order to show lowest gap formation and the best adhesion properties. They have to show fast curing behavior, but also need a large window of processability, so a good processing area for the best results in terms of mounting. And a lot of systems that are used until now and were used more widely in the past were diallyl phthalate-based or DAP-based thermosets, which is here the left molecule shown, which were pretty common thermoset material bases. These tended to cure sufficiently fast and are really dimensionally stable depending on the fillers used. The thing is that these types of materials, these type of thermosets, are not only used in the materialographic business, but also in other areas where sufficient flammability protection was necessary. And for this case, or for this properties, antimony trioxide was used as a modifier for it in order to decrease flammability of the resin. The thing is that both of these components are hazardous. The DAP-based systems, although they cured fast, did not cure fully without sufficient and high modifying or modifications, which leads to the possibility of DAP leaching out into the water during grinding processes. And antimony trioxide as a modifier is also carcinogenic, cancerous, which even led it to being part of another regulation for another list, the SVHC list, the list of substances of very high concerns, especially dangerous because these mounting media are, due to the materialographic preparation itself, ground down into finer dust and bits, which makes it more dangerous in terms of exposure and, for example, inhalability. Substitution might be done on the formulation level, so using any system that does not either contain DAP or antimony trioxide or other antimony containing modifiers, and suiting alternative epoxy resin based systems which do not have any of these compounds. We have here two examples of epoxy resin materials that QATM offers. We have our EPO Max and our EPO Black. The second one especially suiting in terms of chemical compliance, but because it is not subject or does not require any kinds of labeling or classification due to its formulation. Next step is the grinding. We'll take a look into grinding and how these are of concern in terms of chemical compliance. And in this case, we won't start with a question about the requirement, but we talk about the process of grinding itself due to the mounting media used for mounting of samples. These are also ground down during the materialographic process, which means that all mounting media can release smaller parts and particles of the matrix. And due to mounting media usually consisting of some kind of plastic, these microparticles or microplastic formation and release into the grinding water is a big concern. Additionally, a lot of systems contain plasticizer components which decrease the breakability of the system, which increase, for example, durability, but are also released during the grinding process by itself. So basically, if you're not connecting your wastewater to a wastewater treatment option or facility directly, the particles and substances can end up in water, and this leads to significant environmental pollution, which is somehow a necessity following the need of mounting resins for mounting of samples for proper materialographic preparation. However, depending on your needs on your mounting and the following preparation steps, a company can try, or a lab can try to substitute it with so-called water-compatible mounting agents, which either do not contain any plasticizers, which have rather low plastic content. For example, if you have a higher filler content, or the filler is composed of not plastic compounds, but more cellulose compounds, so degradable compounds, if the mounting agents are overall degradable or based on bioplastics, or at least if these compounds that you are necessarily grinding down are based on recycled, so basically are or were recycled once for it in order to improve the overall environmental profile of your system or of the mounting resin. Additionally, just a small informational reminder, not only the mounting resin is abraded down, but also the abrasive media over the terms of its lungs or of its service life. So basically, if you have any system that is dependent on, for example, sandpaper, these sandpaper-based systems, grinding paper-based systems tend to release a lot of abrasive media as well into the grinding water. So exchanging it with a system that has a longer service life might be the proper way to comply to chemical regulations and overall to decrease the waste. So if you can, try to switch from grinding paper to, for example, grinding discs. Following grinding, the usual step following is polishing, and we'll talk about an example here as well. We will start with the leading question of what the requirements for my consumable are, and we'll talk about polishing lubricants in this case, and what are the necessary requirements. It needs sufficient lubrication or lubricating properties and cooling effects, as well as sufficient corrosion protection. So basically pretty similar properties like our anti-corrosion coolant systems need to have. In addition, it needs to have a perfectly cleanable surface afterwards. So basically any residue needs to be cleaned off as easily as possible. And one compound that is usually added for these purposes is ethylene glycol, especially in alcohol-based lubricants, because it has really good lubricating properties. It has a good cooling effect on the system, and it forms pretty thin films of lubricant which are perfectly cleanable afterwards, after the polishing process. And not only did humans found out that ethylene glycol is harmful to health and organotoxic, this concerns or is of regulatory concern, but also the type of application is extremely critical, because where is ethylene glycol used? It is used in a process where humans can have prolonged exposure due to standing on the polishing table. If you're, for example, manually preparing your sample, due to the prolonged exposure, usually the polishing lubricant is applied via a spray bottle when not dosed via a droplet system. So basically, you're making an aerosol, you're making it inhalable in a process that demands longer exposure of your worker in this particular preparation step. And the combination of the already harmful influence or properties of ethylene glycol with the application is particularly critical in this case. And there are several solutions to this problem. You can either substitute ethylene glycol with another diol, in this case, for example, propylene glycol, which does not show any harmful properties to human health. But also, you can try to modify your process, your overall process, and try to, if you're dependent on an ethylene glycol based system, that you are not spraying your lubricant, but try to dose it via droplets onto your polishing system in order to decrease any risks due to the way of how you apply your consumable. We have a variety of diamond lubricants and suspensions that are based on less harmful systems for your everyday purpose in terms of polishing as well. Our last step for today is the process of etching, and I've said it before that we are only scratching the surface of etching, and this is due to the availability of a lot of material in that regards, perfectly available online, so we won't delve too deep into that topic. And there are usually three ways to try to improve on the chemical compliance when using etching agents. The first way is to avoid hazardous substances completely. So by substitution by other components, like we've seen in our other examples, you can try to, for example, exchange your alcoholic picric acid for etching purposes with alcoholic nitric acid solutions, which tend to, depending on the material that you're etching, result in similar etching performance and properties. you can try to reduce the amount of hazardous substances. So basically, if you are not able to completely avoid them, you can try to dilute your etching agent to a less dangerous level. We have here an example, in this case, the example of alcoholic nitric acid, 5%, 5 weight percentage, which shows similar, or depending on the material you're trying to etch, similar etching properties and etching profile compared to less concentrated, more diluted alcoholic nitric acid etching agents, in this case 1 weight percentage. If you're willing to increase, for example, the etching time, or slightly increase the temperature of the etching agent for it in order to increase in reaction or in etching speed. Additionally, you can try to modify your way of etching by either adding additives for improved etching performance, which is usually done by the manufacturer of the etching agent and not necessarily in your lab. You can try to add alkyl sulfonates for improved wetting performance, so basically improving the overall etching performance of your etching system. And you can also try to exchange the etching agent or the classic chemical etching with electrolytic etching. For example, you can perfectly etch duplex steels with the use of oxalic acid and exchange your etching process completely. We are basically at the end of the webinar of today's webinar, and considering chemical compliance, what you can try to keep in mind is that in your process or in the company itself, you can try to think about chemical compliance by asking yourself several questions, like where are consumables used? Consumables play a role in many steps of material preparation, processing, from cutting to grinding to polishing and mounting. So the question is not only what do we use today, but also what we can use tomorrow. What material can I use? How will future regulations change the way we are working with consumables or exchange the availability? We can already see different directions regulations are taking. For example, the PFAS regulation that some of you might know about. Authorities are moving towards more stricter classifications, not necessarily bans, but this might also be the case for some types of substances. That means some chemicals we rely today on may no longer be allowed or available in the near future. Which substances will pose problems in the future? Substances like we've talked about in this webinar, boric acid, ethylene glycol, or CMR compounds might be more tightly regulated or restricted in the future. And thinking or talking about what the alternatives are might be showcasing us some kind of trend. The clear trend is towards more green alternatives. So basically materials and consumables which are completely free of all these compounds that I've talked about in the course of this webinar. And although substitution might be the most common case of how to solve problems in terms of chemical regulation, the way how you're working with consumables might also improve chemical compliance as well. So that's for it for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for attending today's webinar, although this might be a little more specific and not necessarily something that you might concern with materialography. These information are topics of product developers and product managers in this area, in the area of materialographic consumables, and critically asking what you can use, what is available on the market, what might be or change in the future is one way to ensure that materialography has a future and that chemical regulations do not necessarily inhibit progress in materialographic preparation. Keep in mind, if your questions are not answered by now in the chat, we will do so in the next few days via email. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and I hope to see you soon again.